Inkbound is a brand new early access game that I just picked up and haven't been able to put down since. There are 5 different classes, or aspects, to choose from. All of them gain access to a set of shared bindings, or abilities, which you can use in combat. Each binding has various effects and abilities, but from my experience, they are not all created equal. I'm here to share some of my experience with these bindings to help you succeed in your runs. Starting us off, we have After Image. After Image is a skill that costs 1 will and grants you 1 critical charge on a random binding and 1 stack of evasion. That evasion is nice for being able to ignore a direct attack, but really the strength of this binding comes from that random critical charge. Critical charge is a huge damage increase, and you have some control over which binding can gain that critical charge, because if you have critical charge on a weaker binding, you can't give critical charge to it already, so it's going to give it to your higher damage option. And you can also give it to an ally to help protect them, or even give them a free critical charge to do more damage. It's a great flexible skill. And on top of that, it has good ascensions and augments. You can reduce its cost to 0, you can reduce the cooldown of this skill by 1, and when using it, reduce the cooldown of your other skills as well. You can gain movement speed, you can gain more evasion, more critical hits, and even more crit damage with this skill. Its ascensions are pretty freaking good. Blur is everything you want from this binding, it's just better. More crit damage, and more stacks of evasion. It's great to have, it's flexible. But Shadow Image is even more flexible. It allows you to gain ability power at the cost of as much evasion stacks as you want. So you could gain, it gives you how many? Like 10 ability power per stack, and it gives you 5 stacks. So it gives you a 50, the next binding after using Shadow Image has plus 50% damage. That's huge. And you get to keep as much of it as you want for evasion stacks. That's very useful. Very flexible skill. I love this skill. Refraction is the only weak choice. You no longer gain damage and instead gain 4 stacks of evasion. It's a little bit more consistent as a defensive option, but I would honestly prefer the damage. It's easily an A tier skill. Easily an A tier skill. The only thing keeping it out of S tier is that 6 turn cooldown. But honestly, this skill is really freaking good. Next up, we have Cultivate. Cultivate costs 1 will and lets you plant an orb on the ground. That orb gains value over time, and you don't have to get full value out of the orb for it to be incredible. Just 2 or 3 is often enough to completely clear the board, clear the field of all enemies. And even if you do have extra will and no real cooldowns to make use of it, you have a repeatable ability, so you can always make use of extra will. The only times you can't make use of extra will I found is when everything is already dead. And if everything's already dead, well then it's an S tier binding. Easily an S tier binding. And to top it all off, you can give will to your allies. You can plant this on the ground and an ally can pick it up. So if somebody's stranded somewhere where, you know, they're stuck in in like 2 or 3 different circles, you can give them will and then they can get out of there. It's a great flexible skill. You can do so much with the extra energy. And its ascensions and its augments that are game defining, okay? Mushroom Growth just gives you more ability power, just gives you more damage, and it doesn't cost anything extra. Crop Harvest gains defenses, you can gain shield, you can gain health. Extremely useful. I don't think it's as useful as Mushroom Growth, but it can be useful if you need some more health. The Flower Bloom, it costs more to plant, but it gives you more will over time on subsequent turns. I haven't found it to be too much better than the regular Cultivate, Though, I mean, maybe there are, like, some combinations of items that make Flower Bloom completely broken, honestly, and I just haven't found it yet. So keep an eye on Flower Bloom. It might be insane. But its augments, regardless of which option you take, its augments are freaking good, okay? You can gain defenses when you pick it up. You can gain crit when you pick it up. You can gain CDR and more will when you pick it up, and you can reduce the cost of all of your other bindings to 0. So they cost nothing, and then you can do all kinds of crazy things. You can pick up items that reduce your cooldowns whenever you use a single ability. So now this single cultivate allows you to gain will, use bindings, and then reduce the cooldown of your other bindings. And I'm specifically talking about Paradigm Shift. This is fucking broken with Paradigm Shift. And if you get Paradigm Shift, my god, you are going to clear. Literally, you can phase bosses in a single turn. That is how strong this plus Paradigm Shift is. And I honestly haven't played with all the items. There might be some combination that's even more broken and more consistent than Paradigm Shift. But easily a game-defining binding. Easily an S tier. I don't think anything is even close to Cultivate. The only negative, though, is on its own, it doesn't give you CDR on any of your bindings. So if you don't have the item, it's kind of weak. But if you do have the item, you are unstoppable. So it's still S tier, even in those cases where you don't have the item, because you can always make use of extra will. But easily an S tier. This next one is called Cleave. It's a physical damage binding that scales with physical damage and applies a dot called Bleed that also scales with physical damage. So it's pretty much geared towards those classes that primarily do physical damage, but it also does a high burst damage. And Bleed is very useful for burning down bosses and elites. So, and probably the most important part about Bleed I should probably note is that Bleed stacks never fall off. So it's always going to continuously do its damage and continue to build up over a turn. And you're going to probably use it 2 or 3 times on bosses before they phase. So it's going to do a lot of damage. It has some pretty good ascensions and augments as well. Eviscerate is essentially more burst damage and 15 stacks of bleed, but it also procs any on-hit items that you have. Hemorrhage is effectively a direct upgrade of Cleave, which grants the bonus of a hemorrhage stack. This debuff deals bleed damage immediately on being hit, granting even more burst damage. It also has a reduced cooldown from Cleave, so if you want to use this ability multiple times, Hemorrhage is probably the best option for you. Serrated Sweep does damage in a circle around you and applies more stacks of bleed. With this ascension, you can apply bleed to more enemies. However, it does come at the cost of its initial burst damage, but I will note that it does combo well with some of the augments that you can pick up for it. And these augments are like, you can apply more bleed stacks, you can deal more direct damage and apply Shatter, which is a 30% damage increase. And this is probably the important bit. You can gain health and shield per enemy that you hit. So you have a much larger circle with Serrated Sweep, and now you can gain health and shield for each enemy that you hit. And another augment is that you can reduce its cooldown and its cost, which is very useful because it costs 2 will, and it has a very long cooldown. And that long cooldown is really what's holding its back. Apart from that, it has a very short range, so I would only ever consider it if you are a melee specialized class, because if you are ranged, you really don't have to get into the face of your enemies. But it's still, I'm going to put it at an A tier. It's very high burst damage, so you can just clear out some cheap things, some trash, you can just clear it out with the skill. And if you want to focus down a single target, this is probably the best way to do that because bleed stacks never fall off. This next one here is Blink. Blink is your get out of jail free card, get into jail free card. It's your strongest pull out game, or perhaps your strongest pull in game if you are so inclined. You know, you can travel a large distance and avoid any ground damage, or get closer to allow yourself to deal damage, or even hit multiple enemies. It's great for positioning. It's extremely versatile, and it even has incredible augments and ascensions. You know, you can gain defenses with shields or evasion. You can gain a crit damage. You can also reduce CDR and cost reduction. But more importantly, you can spawn an orb, which enables so many synergies and so many shenanigans. And to top it off, it's a free action, so it's always going to be an S tier. You start the turn, you move. You know, it's great, fantastic. Like these ascensions are also all pretty good. You can take any one of them and be fine with it. Okay, Blast lets this binding deal damage, which works great for aspects like the Magma Miner. You know, Flash lets you have even more movement, allowing you to be even more aggressive and exclusively do damage with and be extremely aggressive with your positioning. Okay, Warps gives you control over the battlefield. Enemy displacement is very strong and very rare, and this gives you that. At the start of the turn, enemies, you know, they gather around you in a circle and throw damage in your direction, which doesn't work well for lining up your lines, cones, or arcs. And being able to swap positions with an enemy lets you clump all of those enemies up and land skills while still avoiding the most dangerous position. Okay? The only negative is that it doesn't do damage unless you opt to upgrade it, but even so, it's always going to be an S tier. This is an S tier binding. It's an S tier. Now this skill is called Jinx, and Jinx is a magic attack that deals damage in a small circle at distance, and it deals more damage per stack of dread that you have. You gain dread whenever something dies. You gain 1 stack of dread, and it caps at 10 stacks. But also it's important to note that whenever you use this ability, you consume all stacks of dread. So you build it up and you do a lot of damage, and you build it up and you do a lot of damage. It's because of this reason that its 5-turn cooldown isn't that big a deal, because you need time to build up the stacks. So you spend time building up the stacks, you do the damage, and you spend time building up the stacks and you do the damage. So the 5-turn cooldown is not that big a deal. It's the single highest damage dealing binding you can get out of all of these options. It's very strong skill, and it has some of the best ascensions of any augment. Bewitch is basically a direct upgrade. It does damage and starts you off with 2 stacks of dread, and allows you to use the skill sooner in combat and deal more damage with it. Direct upgrade of Jinx. Dread Harvest, on the other hand. Dread Harvest removes your passive ability to gain dread. So you don't gain dread whenever something dies. Instead, you have to gain dread by killing something with this skill. So basically, you spend an entire combat building up this skill, and then you get to carry those dread stacks with you for the rest of your run. And more importantly, it has a lower cooldown than the regular Jinx. So Dread Harvest becomes this insane damage dealing spike that you get to spam out whenever you want. Really good skill. But probably the most interesting, and honestly my favorite ascension for this, is Grim Vortex. It's just such a cool ability. It does less damage, but it more than makes up for that by the fact that it pulls all enemies in a large area towards you. Remember how I said, like, you know, moving enemies is very rare? This skill does that. And it does that on everything in range. It pulls everything towards you. And by pulling everything towards you, you manipulate the battlefield in this way that's so advantageous. You can move enemies to deal more damage to the entire group. You can stack all of these AoEs on top of each other so that you have more space to maneuver on the rest of the battlefield. And you can pull enemies out of the purple so that you can actually do damage to them. It's so versatile in that way. And on top of all of that, you gain double the passive stacks of dread. It's easily... is it S tier? I don't know. Maybe it's A tier. No, I'm going to leave it at A because it's a lot better for certain aspects than it is for others, but it's still so good. Its augments just improve its capabilities of doing damage and reduce its cost, but it's so good. Its only weakness is that it costs 2 will, and it can take a little while to build up dread initially, but it's easily one of the best bindings for damage you could possibly want. Next up we have Chain Lightning. It's a fairly consistent AoE. There are times when enemies are a little too spaced out for it to be consistent, but it will chain. If you need more AoE, it's a pretty good option. It also applies this stack called Shock, which deals 50% of the next attack to all enemies, 50% of the damage of the next attack to all enemies that have the shocked debuff, which is this huge damage burst option for otherwise single target focused builds like maybe the Magma Miner. I would put it at, I don't know, maybe like a B tier? Yeah, I'd put it at a B tier. I mean, I'll talk about the Ascensions, I guess. Lightning Spear is better at single target damage and allows you to apply multiple stacks of Shocked. It's in a small area, though. So it can be a little bit better at dealing with bosses and a smaller number of enemies, but I would honestly prefer Lightning Storm. It's the opposite of Lightning Spear. It no longer chains to nearby enemies and now just hits everything. Don't think about it. Just click, and it'll easily clear every field of trash you could imagine in a single turn. You don't have to worry about your positioning like you would in the base version, and it works great with high burst damage because it brings its own with 100 damage. And Zapped is basically the direct upgrade of Chain Lightning. It does a little bit more damage on the initial hit and now deals more damage for every consecutive enemy that it chains to. The only issue I have with this is that it has all the same issues as the base version, where if enemies are just too far apart, you're not going to do any consistent damage. Yeah, that's about it. That's why that's why I wouldn't put it higher than something like these two, because these two just do some really good consistent damage, and this one is a little bit less. But if you need to do damage to groups, you can take that. Its augments are all in line with it doing more damage and applying more shocked. So they aren't really incredible, but, you know, it's pretty good. Next up is Incinerate. This skill it's a magic skill that deals burst damage. Not much burst damage. Really, it's all about that applying this dot called Burn. Burn scales off of magic and deals its damage at the start of your next turn and then decreases by 1 stack. So it deals damage in a small distance in a circle, and then it applies the stack. It can give you some reach if you would otherwise need some, but I personally don't really like it. Dots are only very good against dealing with bosses and enemies that have lots of health, which you can kind of kite around and deal damage to them anyway. It doesn't really give you that initial burst to kill off some small crap, but it can be pretty good at burning enemies. Ironic. Its Ascensions are okay. They're okay. I mean, they're what, like Flash Fire applies 1 less burn stack, but doubles all stacks on a single target. So it's very much in line with dealing damage to a single target. So this is where you want to deal damage to bosses and elites. But it also increases its cooldown from 3 turns to 6 turns, so it severely decreases your capabilities of burning the boss. outside of a build that specifically deals a load of burn damage. So I wouldn't really take that one if you're looking for this binding and you don't really do burn damage. Incinerate, on the other hand, applies one less stack like Flash Fire, but deals all burn damage immediately in the area. It is still only useful for aspects that can spec for dealing burn damage. On top of all that, it also increases its cooldown. But I would still probably take it. I would take it over Flash Fire. It's more consistent. Wildfire has the same increased cooldown as Incinerate, but applies double the burn stacks. The best part of this ascension, however, is that when an enemy dies, when it's hit by this binding, it has to die on your turn. So what you hit an enemy with this binding. If it dies on your turn, all of its stacks spread to nearby enemies. This means you can deal the initial damage to a group of small enemies, and if any die, or they all die, you can pass any extra damage off to other enemies. It can be very efficient at dealing its burn damage. Its augments are all in line with dealing more burst damage and applying more stacks and more burn damage, reducing its cost, reducing its cooldown. But the more important thing about this is that there's an augment you can take that deals percent damage to burning enemies. It's pretty late game, but it's pretty strong if you can get it. I'd probably put this, I'd put it here. A little bit worse than Chain Lightning, because I would value burst damage a little bit better than dot damage. And that's one of the weaknesses with dot damage. It happens at the start of your next turn. That's when it does its damage. So enemies still get to heal themselves, or they get to deal damage to you. Or they even they phase during your turn, which can be a little bit problematic. And you end up taking a lot of damage from dots that you otherwise wouldn't want to if you had a burst focused build. And also its small circle means that you can't really hit many enemies with it. So even if you want to apply a load of burn stacks to a lot of things, you're probably not going to do that very consistently. Alright, now we've come to the defensive tools, Shield Wall and Restoration. Shield Wall gives you 4 shield and a stack of spike. Shields will prevent you from taking damage from most sources, and spiked, whenever an enemy hits you with a direct attack, they take some damage. Really, you take this for the defenses, not for that spiked, because the defenses are just going to be more consistent, and it's also a more proactive tool to avoiding damage, while Restoration is a reactive tool. I honestly think the Shield Wall has better ascensions than Restoration. Like, they include, Force Wall, which lets you fulfill your dream of tanking and holding the front line for your enemies. You gain an absurd amount of shield. You gain 10 shield, and you spend all of your will, and you gain 10 shield per will, which can let you just tank a ridiculous amount of damage and just sit in a place that no one else can sit, and just tank everything. Fortify grants you shields, and instead of gaining spiked, you gain resistance, which decreases the amount of damage you take. It's a little less defensive in its raw shield output than than Force Field. But that's because it retains its 1 will cost. So you can do other things while also using Fortify. Palisade Wall increases the amount of spike stacks you have, meaning that if enemies deal direct damage to you, they take damage. But spiked is a little less consistent because, it only deals damage if they hit you with direct attacks. And direct attacks aren't the only way enemies can hit you. And it also has a low shield size, which means you take more damage as well. Preferably, I'm not comfortable with this, with Palisade Wall. Its augments helps you gain more shield and even restore some health as well. Gives you CDR and some more spike stacks. I would put it maybe a B tier. it can help you really live and give you some sustain that you otherwise wouldn't have. And you can also ignore damage, but just because you've ignored the damage doesn't mean that you're in a great position. You know, like, if you're like on the very border of the circle and then it starts closing in on you, it can be a little bit awkward to move out of the way, and it doesn't save you from that damage. It doesn't save you from damage you're doing to yourself by using abilities. I'd put it here. A little bit worse than After Image on the amount of damage you can output with it, which is why I'm putting it at a B tier. But more consistent defensively than After Image. Restoration, on the other hand, restores 4 health every 5 turns. And you can use it on an ally and fulfill that role of being a cleric for your group. And the most important thing about this skill, apart from these 2 defensive skills, is that you can carry health with you between combats. So, you've healed up this combat, well, guess what? The health you gained in this combat is still relevant for the health you've gained in the next combat, It can be very good for saving you from spending money at the well or going to a shrine to take health. It's, health is kind of important for, not dying. That might be important, so if you need health, maybe just maybe you should probably take restoration. Just saying. If you don't want to die, get some health.
Get some help.
It also has some okay ascensions and augments. Greater restoration just heals your 10 extra health. It's a direct upgrade. If you want more health, just take greater restoration. Quick Mend reduces its cooldown if you're taking damage. Though, if you're taking damage, this is not going to be able to save you. You're usually taking damage in instances of 4 and 5 damage at a time. So, I would, avoid taking damage in the first place, and you wouldn't have to heal the damage afterwards. Regeneration, on the other hand, reduces the amount of health that you gain instantly, but instead restores health at the start of the turn. And you can stack this up to 5 times, allowing you to use this skill more proactively and gain health over time. You can heal up to, I think, 10 health per turn, which is pretty good. Or maybe it's 5? I'm not sure, because the skill itself says 2 per turn, but the debuff says 1? So either you heal 10 per turn or 5 per turn, I'm not sure. It's still probably one of the better options between the 2. And its augments are all in line with healing and gaining shield and damage reduction. It also can gain you cost discount and some CDR on the skill. But I still think it's worse than Shield Wall and After Image because, well, it's better to just avoid damage than to reactively heal it up afterwards. And it also doesn't do any damage, while these ones do. This one a bit limited in its scope, but this does nothing. So, I'd put it at a C tier. It's not terrible. If you need healing, you should probably pick it up. But healing also isn't bad, and also it's not hard to come by because, like I said earlier, you can pay for it at the I forget what it's called, at the well. You can pay for it at the well. It costs 75 quillings, and you gain some health. Or you can pick it up at the shrine. It's not hard to come by, and you aren't taking so much damage in a single turn that you need to heal. If you are, you're probably not doing enough damage to kill everything. So, do more damage. It's going to be a C tier. Maybe a B tier? No, it's going to be a C tier. Still a good binding, but not the best. This next skill I've tried to make work several times. It's called Invigorate, and it grants you 10 ability power for your next binding. Ability power just grants you plus 10% damage to all sources per stack, so this basically gives you 10 stacks, which doubles your damage of your next binding. It works well for high damage bindings, but it only works on one binding. That's important. Only one binding. So if you have a single skill that does a lot of damage, this is great for that. But if your damage is kind of spread throughout a few of your skills, you're probably better off doing something else with your turn, and with your energy, with your will. I should probably be more specific. It has some okay ascensions and augments. Adrenaline Rush grants you bonus ability power for having missing health. It works well with items that increase your maximum health. So this way you don't actually have to lose health to gain the ability power. The next one is called Battle Cry. It grants you only 2 ability power, but it lasts the rest of combat. Okay? Don't think that it's just about scaling damage as a fight drags on.
These nuts. Got him!
It's more important that you can use Battle Cry on multiple bindings per turn. It's just a much more consistent damage increase for everything. And finally, Call to Arms lets you grant 10 ability power to an ally. It does nothing for yourself, so don't pick this up unless you have another ally or something. And it's only useful in a group where you want to be a supportive in a supportive role, I guess. But I honestly wouldn't even consider picking this up. The augments you can pick reduce its cooldown and the cooldown of other skills after you use this. It can give you a crit charge. It can also restore some health and gain damage resistance. You can gain even more ability power, and you can reduce the cost of a random skill. But I personally don't like it. I'm gonna put this at a C tier. It should really be able to carry over for a turn so that you can make use of this when you only have like 1 will left, like so that you can use that last remaining will, and then your next turn you can do some big pop-off damage. That would make it pretty good. Other than that, it only works well later on in your run when you have a lot of damage already, because you've been building it up from items and from picking up magic damage or physical power. It gets better, but early on you're probably better off picking up something else. Oh boy. Understanding Pilfer could take an entire video all on its own. This costs 1 will and has a cooldown of 5 turns, but it lets you steal quillings from 1 enemy. So its entire value is dependent on what you're using your quillings for. You can use it for items, you can use it for health, you can use it for augments. Those are the kinds of things you can use quillings for, and its value is going to depend on the value of the items that you're picking up. I should probably mention that its ascensions, one of them, Heist, lets you steal an item from an enemy, which can have pretty insane outcomes, but you cannot pick up that item in combat, and you do get a higher rarity item from stealing from bosses and elite monsters. So, you know, you can get some pretty good stuff out of Pilfer, out of Heist. Mug lets you deal damage with this skill, and you gain more quillings if this skill kills something. Plunder lets you steal a consumable in combat. I haven't tested if you can pick up a dropped consumable in combat, so maybe that's possible. Maybe that's like a hidden strength of Plunder, but I probably wouldn't take Plunder as the best option. Its augments can be they're pretty varied in what they can do. You can steal health, you can gain movement speed, you can reduce the cost and cooldown of this, you can steal more quillings, you can also steal from multiple enemies, you can steal an orb, and an orb is very strong. But you can also, there's a chance that you just drop an item whenever you use this. So it basically has that Heist ascension as an augment, which can be very strong. It's a small chance, but more items is better than none. Ugh, the negatives though. I mean, like, it does no damage on its own. And its value is entirely dependent on the items you get out of Quillings. Like, this can be S tier, or it could be D tier. Like, the variance on this skill is very wide. It's very wide. I'm probably going to put this at a B tier just for now. I'll probably, maybe do another video explaining the value of Pilfer later on, but it's just basically gambling. It's just basically gambling, and it doesn't really do much in combat and costs you a will. I'll leave it at B tier. Yeah, I'll leave it at a B tier. It's also, it has a very limited range, so it's not very good for some classes. Yeah, I'll leave it at B tier. I'll leave it at a B tier. Alright, this next skill is Poison Nova, and it's significantly easier to rate. It's a D tier. It does very, very little burst damage in a very wide area, but it means that it's not very good at dealing with small trash mobs, even though it deals damage in a wide area. Yes, you're applying a lot of poison stacks to many things, but those things aren't dying before they can do their damage to you, which can be a problem. It's the poison version of Incinerate, only very good in builds that can build poison, and there's only one class that can do that, the Moss Cloak, and even then, it's like the worst builds, the worst options. There are better options for the Moss Cloak to take, so I don't value it very highly. Its ascensions are, Poison Dart. It loses its area of effect, and now affects a single enemy and doubles the stacks of poison. It's Petrify. Petrify deals more burst damage, but still not much, and deals damage in a small circle. You can cast at a distance, but it then deals all poison damage instantly, which is important. It basically lets you double down on the amount of poison stacks that you have. Toxify increases the range of poison vapor and applies a debuff called Toxic. This effect spreads the poison stacks you have to other enemies when they die. Applying Toxic means that your poison stacks become more effective, though it only spreads half of the stacks, and that's because poison depreciates very quickly. It loses half of its stacks every turn, which means that you have to build up a lot of stacks. Yes, on its own, this does 30 stacks, but half of those are gone at the start of your next turn. But probably the worst thing about it is that poison is just the worst dot you could possibly have in this game. It does only 5 damage per stack, whereas other ones do 10 damage per stack. It's just, its augments are okay. You can deal more damage and deal more poison damage. In a wider AoE, you get a cost discount, cost reduction, and you can also do percent damage to poisoned enemies, which is pretty good. It's similar to Incendiary in that way. But I still don't really like poison. Dots are just very weak because enemies still just get to attack you before they do their damage. So you end up taking a lot of damage, and especially if you are a Moss Cloak, you're kind of in the fray and you end up taking a lot of damage. You don't really have that many ways of recovery, even though you're a melee character. I don't really like it. It's a D tier. Finally, we have Cone of Cold. Cone of Cold? Cone of Frost, I mean. I call it Cone of Cold all the time. Not just because the alliteration sounds better, but because its initials spell...
Wiener?
It's a magic damage dealing binding that does a dot damage. Well, it's not a dot damage, it applies a stack of Frostbite. Now, Frostbite deals damage every time you hit that enemy, again, for whatever your Frostbite damage is. So, if an enemy takes damage, when it has Frostbite, it deals that Frostbite damage and then loses 1 stack. And it works well with bindings that do lots of consecutive damage. And it works well with bindings that deal damage. So if you have a binding that doesn't deal damage, well, it's not going to proc Frostbite. Its ascensions are pretty good. They're pretty good. Blizzard does damage in a small circle around you. Well, it's not really a small circle. It's a large circle around you. It has a low initial damage, but applies stacks to a lot of enemies. It can give you some reach to kill off some small things, but really it's there to just apply Frostbite to basically the entire screen. And the best thing about Frostbite is that it never depreciates. It stays on the enemy for until you hit it, or it dies. Basically, that's it. That's the only way its Frostbite stacks are going away, or it phases. I guess that's the only other caveat. It will go away when things phase, when bosses phase, but it'll stay there until you hit it. And Blizzard is your way of applying stacks to basically everything. Flash Freeze lets you deal damage in a small circle at a distance. Okay, it has a high burst damage, and inflicts Daze, which is a debuff that reduces the amount of damage that enemy will deal. Okay, and it can be useful for some reach, and Dazed isn't great, but it can be useful for preventing damage that you would have to take, like direct damage, but usually should be avoiding damage. Frigid Gust increases the cone of the attack, but applies more stacks and deals more damage. It's just functionally an upgrade to the Cone of Frost. However, 7 stacks of Frostbite is often a lot more than you need to kill most enemies, so you probably don't need to apply 7 stacks. Its augments are just all in line with increasing its damage and its Frostbite damage. You can gain a wider area of effect, and you can deal percent damage to enemies with Frostbite. That's probably the best part about the skill. Best part about all these skills, really, that apply stacks. You can do percentage damage, but Frostbite a little bit better than that, because you can deal all of the Frostbite damage the turn that you apply Frostbite. So let's say I apply 4 stacks of Frostbite to an enemy. I can then hit them 4 times the turn that I use this, and all of that damage is done instantly. The only downside to Cone of Frost is that it has a limited arc. It just, if you don't upgrade it, it's kind of weak in how far it can reach. So it's kind of, you would only really take it if you were like a melee centered class that gets close to anything. But otherwise, I probably wouldn't take it. Its short range just probably limits it. I'd probably put it at a B tier with all of these other things. I should mention that this is not like in order in here. Like, maybe this is better than here, but I'm just gonna leave it here just because that's the order in which I put these things. And that's it. That's the end of the tier list. That's all of the shared bindings currently available in Inkbound. This tier list isn't final. Maybe things can move, like Pilfer. It's probably the best thing that could probably move. It's probably rated a little bit better, but I'm gonna leave it a B tier just because its variance is very, very wide. And also, this isn't very specific for any one class or aspect, and I might revisit this and make other tier lists for each one. And alright, leave it a like if you agree and thought this was informative, and tell me what you would change in the comment section. And if you managed to get this far, thank you guys for watching.